interpretation, there's an interpretation button at the
Para
bottom
los que yeah.
that looks like a globe, and you can go in there for English interpretation for this event. Great. Soy Connie Gonzalez y soy gerente de...
I'm Connie Gonzalez, and I'm manager of programs in CIPE for women and within CIPE. I will be with you today as a moderator. This event is supported by the regional team of Latin America and the Caribbean, the International Center for Private Enterprises, and for the empowerment of women to close March and celebrate the International Day of Women. This event is part of an initiative on the future of work. This began in October of last year to stimulate the dialogue and how COVID is affecting the different models of work in Latin America. We know that the impact of the pandemics has been strong in the region, but there are opportunities to reevaluate a relaunch of the economy that will improve the labor market in Latin America. We have gathered people from the investigations, from R&D, civil society, and the private sector to analyze the responses to the pandemics in different areas within the region to see what reforms are pending for the long term and for the change of Latin America. Today we're exploring this and how it has to do with women in the economic and the recovery of women in Latin America post-COVID. We have the pleasure of having two panelists with us. Claudia Umaña is Vice President of FUSADES, which is a think tank dedicated to the economic development of El Salvador. And Gala Diaz, who is the director of the Social Protection Program of CIPE, which is a think tank that promotes a democratic and efficient state in Argentina. Their full biographies are in the invitation today, in case you want to check them. We will start with a few short presentations. We have the panelists, and then we will start with some questions. If you have any questions, you can place them on the chat, and then my colleagues will be monitoring them. We will start with Claudia. Thank you, Connie, for this kind invitation that, without a doubt, we will continue talking about something that I'm passionate about. And I want to thank the whole CIPE team who's doing a follow-up to this, about this, especially around the International Women's Day, which, ends now with this activity, as I understand. So the future work and the empowerment of women is something that, for me, is very closely related to digitalization. And see, with this image of a woman looking towards the future, this is how we saw ourselves in FUSADES 3 years ago, when we had invited the president, or the former president of Estonia. I always have a hard time with the last name, Thomas Eels, and I thought it was fascinating to see how the digitalization is in the developed world. But what especially caught my attention is that digitalization is a change in the way of thinking. It is leaving our comfort zone. It is leaving the complex processes, the repetitive processes that we have sometimes in Latin America. And technology is a tool, but what matters is the reset and the cultural change. So we're looking towards the future. Well, we would think, okay, but what's the starting point in our countries? What was the starting point before COVID? And in the case of El Salvador, things were very muddled because there were inequalities, informalities, and unemployment. Basically, the inequality for lack of opportunities for women and the heavy workload at home for us, for them, especially for young women with small children, salaries, salary gaps, and of course, the lack of opportunities. And we could see, for example, that before COVID, the participation in the labor market of women was 50% versus men that were 85% employed. Also, women also are heavily involved in the informal market. This is an endemic, especially in El Salvador. 70% of the economy is informal.
de las mayores
After that, women are, or most of these small or SMEs, informal SMEs, are owned by women, and they're heavily involved in commerce or trade. So we could see that this was one of the largely affected sectors by the pandemic. So at a Latin American level, according to the World Labor Organization, 13 million jobs were lost because of COVID. So 25 million women were left unemployed. So in this reality, COVID came in and changed our life. It changed the way we work, the way we buy, the way we look after our families, confinement, education as a challenge, these, with the gaps, because now we had to be looking after the children and helping them in their work, but working ourselves, taking care of the older generations in our home, our grandparents. So all of these barriers that there used to be when we lived together merged. So there's no more barriers. And also in this catastrophe, we went back, we had a regression of over a decade in job participation according to the IDB. So the urgency of the recovery of jobs, especially for women, work for the future is a great necessity. So it has changed our life, and looking towards the future, we said, let's stop looking towards the future. The future is now. So I think we have to recover that dream of that future where there is this digital republic, but also in a world that is more inclusive and where women can have more opportunities, and let's not let anyone stay behind. And for that, COVID was a catalyst. COVID was something that disentangled a reality where about the importance of digital connectivity and collectiveness was evident. From one day to the next, we had to obtain basic services like health, education, or continue with our professional lives with another way of working. And before that, we realized it was a very hard reality. First, there was a great lack of digital abilities, which in this today, which was 2020, we realized that most of the women in Latin America did not have this alphabetization or this knowledge. We also needed economic resources. After an example that I saw was very interesting on how to have access to technology, how to have access to broadband, because in one home, we had to fight for the use of internet. And devices to connect, the lack of relevant content and local languages, Spanish, because sometimes a lot of this knowledge is in English. That was another barrier for Latin American women. And this, being able to see all of this, the World Economic Forum gave it a level of relevance that I would like to highlight. But also, after some studies that we did, where the UNTA did, we realized that things have changed forever. And they have changed because COVID-19 has accelerated a world. It has made us more digital, but 53% of the persons polled said that they will continue buying online after the pandemic. This but the changes are here to stay. The patterns, the buying patterns also changed. Now we increase the use of e-trade. And for us women, we had to develop this dexterity because we were trying to raise our kids, trying to have access to products from our confined spaces, but also we had to talk to loved ones, especially to, at least in El Salvador, but yes, also in many Central American and Latin American regions, our family is divided. We have family abroad, so we need connection for our day-to-day life, for our trade, for our education, for our children, and also to stay connected professionally. This pre-COVID world, there already was this concern, and I want to highlight certain statistics. A national entity that is called CONAMIPE, it's a national commission that supports SMEs, and they did a series of surveys, pre-COVID polls, and according to them, 83% of the population did not use internet tools before COVID. With regards to, imagine SMEs, 83% of SMEs. And these are companies that generate a source of income and provide employment for other women. So the way that we connected with digitalization was completely stuck. 54% had never used a device for communications with clients or suppliers. Imagine the challenge. And of course, part of this is because there is a barrier that is digital alpha or learning how to use digital devices. So then we say, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? What do? Do we first get technology or knowledge? And here it's about doing things in a multimodal way, but knowledge is the key. I would like to share with you all that during these months, a very important network called Voces Vitales or Vital Voices in El Salvador did a survey or a poll for 120 women, business women, that were trying to move along in COVID times. And it pointed out that 32% of the women had said that for them, a priority was the use of networks because COVID had made them have to change the way they worked. So they started to overcome all these hurdles. And even though COVID was affecting them, it removed the fear, and women started to dare and they started trying and innovated. So 73% of the sales became online. And I must say that from every 2 women, 1 started offering new products thanks to this new way of interacting through the social media or networks. But imagine how important knowledge is and what we were saying about economic resources. We needed them, and we see how, or at least 75% of the women had invested at least $500 in technology. And it's not just having devices as how to use them, but it's interesting that 11% of them had received some type of financing. That's where we also need the state to take part and help support the private enterprises. So there was a sense of need, a sense of urgency, and we saw this learning how to use digital devices accelerate through training and working in networks. But something that I would like to highlight, because it's something that I always say in this type of meetings, digital transformation is about talent, skills, and abilities. So I did want to put this transformation of the butterfly because it's exactly a type of change. We're changing the structure. We're becoming something totally different, and that is the huge transformation that Latin American women must. We have to continue pushing ourselves, and nobody can stay behind. So the need of working together, I'd like to mention again what the work in networks is like to close the gap. And in that sense, from Funsales, we have a network of professional women called Synergias to share information, best practices, what's happening in the world, what's going on, what is CIPE doing, what is the World Economic Forum doing, because it helps to inspire, it helps things to not leave the national agenda. And on the other side, we were fortunate enough to be able to organize a consortium for digital development in El Salvador. And it's called País Digital, or Digital Nation. And we had several NGOs and also different associations that have to do with the development of technologies, companies such as net services, broadband companies. So the business issue of specific knowledge on technologies, but also an aspects related to empowerment of women, but above all, competitiveness and modernization, and that Latin American nations cannot stay behind and we cannot be isolated. We also did strategic alliances internationally with the George Bush Presidential Center because we created a webpage called Central American Prosperity Project, through which what we did was a group of leaders that was established and emerging leaders. Well, we found what the problems, what the hurdles were for development in the region. And regarding women, we needed to, and also for our nations, if we are not a source, if not, we are a source of immigrations all the time, because people that do not find we do not find chances in our countries immigrate to the US. So how can we help them stay in our countries? How can we show them that they can have a good life in Latin America, a worthy life? And that's why we chose digitalization, or digitizing that as a main axis. I want to also mention that the government helped us with an agenda, a digital agenda, with these very macro items, digital identity, digital governance, modernizing the state, innovation, education, and competitiveness, but there still is a lot of work from public and private alliance. We have, obviously, and there's here we can improve this. We have not talked about the gender issue. We should work more on education and also this alliance between the scientists and the companies, because if not, it's all roads that don't really lead anywhere and are not articulated, they're not connected. So what's next? And this is how I wrap up my presentation. We have to strengthen the digital ecosystem under a multidimensional vision, which sounds complex or sounds easy. I mean, it's hard to say, it's hard to pronounce, easy to say, but hard to do. We have to make connectivity become a maximum priority. This is one of the we have to obtain the 75% of the broadband penetration at a low cost of the SDGs. Because if not, then we always go back to the lack of resources, and with things becoming so expensive in our young economies, well, we have to make it affordable so that technology and empowerment can be an issue of one group and not, or we have to make it inclusive and democratic. Also, encourage knowledge and alliances in practical ways. For the toolkits, there's several projects in Latin America where we are encouraging this, and especially for the SMEs. And I mention this because women are the key players, or women are the front line of these companies, and cooperation, of course, is important to promote this agenda for digital inclusion in the new normal. I'm so happy to have been part of this event, or to be part of it, because we see how important it is, and believe me, from all of our organizations, we will not stop raising awareness on this. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Claudia,
Thank you, Claudia, for your presentation. It was very thorough. You mentioned the challenges that we have as women and the digital gaps that we have as nations, and also some opportunities of creating new connections, and the importance of the networks and the support and financial support and cooperation that is so necessary for this inclusive development. Now I would like to hand the mic to Gala for her presentation. Thank you, Connie. Thank you also, Claudia, for the presentation. I think that it's very well aligned with what I wanted to share with you. I will share my screen so that we can start. And I wanted to start with a similar point, that is, where were we before everything with the digital gaps in the labor market? In the whole region, we see that women had a lack of access to work. Only in Argentina, for example, only 6 of every 10 women are part of the work of the labor market. But in men, it's 8 out of every 10 men that are working or looking for work. So there is a smaller access from the basic point, from the point of access. Something that I forgot to mention in the beginning, and I will continue talking about men and women, but we know that that these gaps in the market are even larger, but we don't have enough information. We know this as or from specific investigations that were made in some jurisdictions where this was registered, but all of these barriers are even higher. After this first access barrier, we look at the people that do participate in the economy, that are part of the economy. We see that there are gaps along the path, along the way. This means that women get jobs that are worse than those that are offered to men. We have less social security or social protection. We have more responsibilities, and we suffer more with unemployment or subemployment. We work longer hours, and all of this has a repercussion in the money or the salary that we are paid, the wages that we are paid, that is less than for men. We talk about a salary gap, and I always say that a salary gap is not a problem in itself. It's not, but it is a discrimination because women get paid much less than women get paid less than men. But this is just a symptom of all of the issues that are more structural and more difficult to overcome than a simple discrimination that we could solve just by paying them the same amount. So it is necessary to work at this more structural issues to overcome the real gaps. This less and worse participation of the women in the labor market also ends up in less access to decision-making roles. This happens even though women, or in most of the countries in the region, are having more education than men. So we have a population that is better trained. The women are generally better trained than men, but they have worse jobs and worse opportunities. This is also seen in general, but specifically in the areas connected to engineering, math, sciences. Large part of these gaps that I mentioned are connected to a smaller participation of women in the more dynamic sectors of the economy. And it's related to the fact that there's very few women, or there's very few sectors that are connected to these areas. And this is a decision, so to speak, as I put in the presentation, because actually it is a decision that is very restricted because of the context of the social norms and cultural norms that affect us as
opciones viables para nuestro desarrollo profesional.
what we women see as feasible women for our as a profession. There's been many studies about this. Some, for example, are very interesting on toys. What toys are for girls, what toys are for men, or most of the toys for women have to do with beauty stereotypes or brooms or other appliances for housework. But the toys for boys are generally cars and pistols or swords or things related to violence and IT. So even from a very early age, we give them different toys, and that also sort of guide their future. And in the education, there's also this, and there's studies that show how in the early education, especially between the 6 and the 8 years, they reinforce these stereotypes, and girls, well, there's a big drop in those years in the belief that girls are not good for hard sciences and biology, maths, etc. This has to do with a lack in engineering, math, and with sense, with gender in vocational decisions. This vicious cycle that we mentioned, this was techos de cristal means crystal ceilings. The thing is that there are not enough women in decision-making roles. So this lack of opportunity to decision-making roles can be seen specifically in the technology field and sciences. If there are women in these fields, usually they have more junior roles, and it's less likely that they can lead any investigation roles and side papers, etc. This is explained in a great way because of the unbalanced load, and it has to do with what are the standards that are expected from women in these roles. For example, the evaluation criteria are very connected to the possibility of being able to communicate. And as a scientist, the fact that women have maternity leave is heavily it's looked down on, and this fades back on the lack of management roles. When there are no leading women in these fields, it's less likely that boys and girls can see them as an inspiration, and then we always stereotype the genders that are an obstacle for this. Finally, it's also necessary to create more information about this and evaluate public policies to better understand what works and what doesn't work to improve this problem. For this, it is important to understand what happened last year. Last year, essentially, there were more inequalities. Why? First, what happened in the labor market? As I said, women already had a worse situation, and this became worse last year in Argentina. We didn't go back 10 years like in El Salvador. We were already stuck. We have already been stuck in the last 20 years, but there was an important decrease that we're going back to the 90s, I think. We're close to how we were in the 90s. Women felt left out of the labor market in the pandemics, especially those that had informal jobs. A fifth of women work in households as maids. A large part of them are in the informal market, and so obviously during isolation terms they didn't make any money. Women also have a larger participation in the health arena, so they were more exposed to the virus because they worked in hospitals. And they had issues because they had to go out and work during the isolation months, but they had to come back home, so that there was a threat for bringing the virus home. Also, working from home, jobs that allow working from home usually are given to men. So we as women had more chances of having to go out and work physically. All of this, of course, is very closely related to the socioeconomic status. Usually the women who make the lowest income were more affected last year and this year. The second channel through which the pandemics amplified this is what happened inside the homes. Social isolation meant the suspension of classes and formal education and recreation activities in which the families could reduce the time that is important to invest in raising children, but also for the population's older people or disabled people. And this extra investment of time that families had to do with it to care for them, this extra time was invested by women. Women had to cover for all of the tasks and all of that extra time that these tasks accounted for, with the exception of having to go shopping, because this was mostly done by men, because obviously it allowed them to leave the home and take some air. So what happened within the homes, again, is strongly related to the social economic status, because it's the families, the lowest incomes that are usually have to work with, live with all of their children, and 20% of the poorest population, or 92% of the families have children. But if we look at the 20%, the wealthiest 20%, only 40% of the families live with boys and girls, with children. So there is a distribution of the well-being that affects the families that have children, and also the families of certain setups. Nuclear family is not the most common ones. There's families with only one parent, or there's families with children from both spouses or from previous families. And then there's also a lot of tension in the homes, and there was more tension and more violence and less time available to look for work and to look for a way of generating income. What can we do before this extreme scenario? First, we have to understand what there is behind the gaps. One of the main factors to determine this is the social norms. Social norms is what we expect from a person according to their gender. And this is closely related to what I said before. What stereotypes are we generating? And it is possible to work on the social norms. This means, of course, cultural damage that is very structural and long dated, but it is possible to accelerate this cultural change with some policies. A very concrete example, because I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to go fast, but are the maternity leaves. Fathers should also have a leave because they have to be more involved in the first days. So this is already patterns different than the ones we have now. We would, because now the father's license or the father's leave is only 2 days versus 2 months for the mom. Okay, social norms, more women, and also quotas for women. This would improve the performance because, well, women do have more training in general. So this could also be inspiring for future generations. Now the third place, reducing care. Reducing also has to do with more participation of the country in promoting and redistributing tasks within the jobs, looking for more responsibility by everyone, and not load, not for the women to have not such a heavy workload. Women, or everyone in general, does not have a lot of information about different options for work. More information would be key. More information on the possibilities of generating better jobs and better pay. This is key also to have a larger participation of women in these sectors. All of this, of course, has to be supported by a restructuring. None of this will have an impact in improving the participation of women if we continue having a scenario of an economic recession where there are more jobs being lost than created. It's also important to have this intersection outlook when we restructure or rethink the labor market. Now we've got some sectors that are very dynamic in the economy. They're moving fast. And then we've got the rest of the labor market that goes at a very slow pace. This is also connected a lot with what is the workforce in the different sectors. To solve the gender gaps, we also need to solve the socioeconomic gaps. And so what can we do to have people of a lower grades in the more dynamic sectors of the economy and the sectors connected to science, psychology, engineering, and math? Closing these gaps means solving a great part of these problems. Why does it matter, and what can we do? Right? How can we make out of this opportunity, out of this crisis, an opportunity? It's important because now a lot of people's rights are being vulnerable because they cannot reach their full potential. But we do know that this argument is not good enough. So I bring another 2 arguments. There is a connection between equity and development. If we cannot close these gaps, it's impossible to sustain development. If the development is not inclusive, it's not sustainable. And finally, our countries in Latin America are reaching their peak of the demographic. What the population gap now? There's more young people than older people, the people between 15 and 64, than those people that depend on our resources. The population in Latin America is aging. So by 2040, 2050, depending on the country, or even before in the case of Uruguay and Costa Rica, there will be the end of the peak, and this will mean that our population is aging, and most of the population will be older than the young generation. This is a great tension for the societies because we have to sustain them, and also within every family, and how to achieve this. In order to not have a collective default, we have to make sure that everybody that is in the working age can work, and that this work be as productive as can be. That is why we have to pay attention to this. So out of this crisis that was made more acute by the pandemics, we can make out of this crisis an opportunity. It's such a structural change that we have to look at the foundations of our labor markets to understand where the inequality is. We have to see them so that we can take this opportunity to look at the structure that led us to having these current problems and to generate a society and a development that is more inclusive for everyone. Thank you very much.
presentación.
Thank you, Gala, for your presentation. And thank you for mentioning some of the gaps and the challenges that we have and the leadership. I think it's very important as a way of response before this pandemic and also the crisis caused by it. You gave some clear examples of how we can respond. And now, before we do the Q&A, I do want to mention the response issue. I want to ask, what efforts or responses have you seen from the governments in your countries or in the private sector, specifically in the digitization? Claudia, can we start with you?
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. I consider that there have been, efforts in the public and private sectors. In the case of El Salvador, the efforts have been macro, and it was more like a series of bonus and generalized support, and it has had to be more for sort of an individual effort than something that was better prepared. I think that pandemics has been something that has generated a level of more, it's more like grants than organizations. So what I do think that the pandemics did do is that it made visible or made the needs visible. And there have been efforts from the civil society, as I was mentioning, to be able to start organizing and identifying where the needs are, talking about the unemployment of women, the private sector. I do acknowledge that it has been seeing how to normalize this and also trying to recover some of the people that had been left behind or had already lost their jobs. Like Dana said, not all that was lost is continues to be lost. But what happens is that if, as was done in the US, how do we build back better? Because if we will only rebuild and go back to where we were, well, it won't be any good. So we have to take advantage of these times and make it better. So from the side of the government, what I did see were grants, $300, but there was no clear goal, clear objective that it, I don't know, that should be for employability, or it was more like a very generic support, a generic help, and it had to do more with buying food. I do want to talk about that agenda that goes to 2030 that was presented by the government, but now that the first moments of the pandemics are over, now we're sort of going back to normal. I think we do still need to open these spaces so that's around different topics we can continue. I will talk to you just about one issue that has to do with the digital identity. Digital identity in these times was vital for two things that we saw in El Salvador and other countries. One is to have for these transfers, for these money transfers, the state had to, or what, it was difficult for the government to find the people to give the money to, because the databases of our countries, well, they're not very well made, and also the use of the identity of people for the vaccination processes. So here you see how the state is trying to, as well as the private enterprises, to move forward in the digitalization, but starting from the very basics, which is digital identity. And I do want to highlight that through the banking system or sector, there has been progress, especially for digital payments, and it goes forward the use also so that there's more interoperability. There's been some efforts, but in these times, from the Legislative Assembly of El Salvador, we have seen a capacity to articulate legislation that was still pending, or at least to talk about it with regards to e-trade or cybersecurity. Before, in El Salvador, they were a little bit sort of hidden, but they are part of the shared agenda now. So the legislation part is moving slowly, but it's moving forward. And what does concern me a lot is the implementation. In Latin America, everybody talks about the laws and creating laws, but then we stay behind when we have to enforce those laws. So we have to work on articulating practical aspects. We have to measure the success. We have to have good indicators for follow-up and invest in technology. And sadly, there is not a lot of access to information. We need more transparency to be able to follow up.
Muchas gracias, Claudia. Gala, no sé si quiere agregar
Gala?
algo, porque veo que estaba así de acuerdo con algunas
You seemed to nod along. No, I just want to add that to what Claudia was saying, that a lot of this happened in Argentina as well. So maybe 3 concrete things that happened here to make it very clear could be interesting. First, this sense of urgency that Claudia mentioned made a large part of the paperwork and the public administration went digital, and that forced the government to be, we would never even have dreamed about this a year or 2 years ago. So it did force the governments to do this, and this contributed, and it made a lot of the paperwork more accessible because there's no more paperwork now. The second thing is that starting the money transfers that were massive last year for the most vulnerable populations to be sustained, we managed to have people go into the banking system. Large part of the population this could contribute to a more formalization of the economy. And then the third place, in going towards the private sector, Connie, you mentioned in January of this year, we approved a teleworking law that we've been working with during all of last year. This law covers remote work or working from home for the private sector. And there was a lot of discussion with the unions of how do we guarantee labor guarantees. And then we can go to another seminar to talk more about this. I will only bring one thing to the table because it has to do with technology and gender. This law includes a license for the care of children who don't have the guarantee of going back to school. And this license, it doesn't say who has to take this leave. This leave existed for public servants last year, and we saw that a lot of the women, most of the people who took advantage of this tool, this leave, were women. We understand that it was a way of helping people cover those extra hours needed at home. But if only women use the leave, then it could even broaden the gender gaps. So we have to rethink these policies because the intent is good, but we could create more harm than good. We could do more harm than good. Thank you, Gala. And now touching on some of the issues towards the end of your presentation, what would be your vision of success? You mentioned 3 reasons. why we should care, what would be, I don't know, 1 year or 5 years, and how could they help the government, the civil society? How could we get there? I think it's a structural issue, and as a structural issue, it's necessary to cover it the same way. And that means especially working on the early childhoods to build a more fair future. This means broadening the policies and trying to fight against the stereotyping as from an early childhood. What can be done in the short term? That for me, 5-10 years is short term. On the one hand, we can motivate more women in decision-making roles, set mechanisms that are transparent and are merit-based, really merit-based in decision-making roles. We usually think that these tools would actually ensure that people are chosen based on merit, and we shouldn't look at other characteristics that are not relevant for what is needed, such as gender, ethnics, etc. So clear goals, clear gender goals for decision-making roles could be an interesting policy to accelerate their participation. And finally, it's important to think this problem in a more integrated way. In Argentina and other countries of the region, like Brazil and Mexico, we've had the opportunity working on these issues. We see that there is progress and in thinking from the private sector, but there is no real connection or not such a strong connection between the private and public sectors as we would like. The state has to become much more involved. It is an issue it's a problem that everybody has, and no party can work alone. No sector can work alone if they don't think in a real solution. Thank you, Gala. We have one question here about the coalition, of Latin America to empower women. I don't know if you know that coalition, but I think that it could be, we could focus this question more on leadership. And Claudia, I would like to give you the mic, so could you mention something about this and the leadership? How do we encourage the leadership of women to be part of the process, this vision towards the future? I adhere to Gala's words because we do need more women in leadership roles. This will make the difference. I think that connecting the efforts, and that's where I always say that, okay, how many people are we here? I think there was 44 people. We need the men and the women to connect or to join efforts. So this type of networks, like the one you just mentioned, will sound good in theory, but the hard part of networking is the sustainability of the efforts. It's like we all have these peaks of enthusiasm and then we can't manage to sustain them. So I think that the networking, and Gala recently mentioned something that I love. And every time I can, I say it, I mention it. And it's the fact that sometimes women do not manage to have these references, these international references, these role models. And we need, in this union of empowerment and technology, we need to generate more women references so that this leadership can be more and more natural. I feel that, at least in El Salvador, sometimes this issue is still all about men, because what we think is, okay, the big business of taking internet somewhere or how to make a huge investment here or there. And it's not about that. It's about that we should see it in a all-encompassing manner. And it has to go through, we have to go from the classrooms. See, at one point I wanted to, but I didn't make it. I wanted to finish my presentation with a picture of a girl standing or up on a tree with her parents' cell phone so that she could have access to the internet so that she could study. This is something normal in El Salvador, in the rural areas. So the gap is even larger because that little girl has
que ella se logre incorporar
obstacles to be able to study. So until she can catch up and get a job and have her job through the years, through all of the different layers and her maternity, her leave, taking care of her parents, and there's so much weight on her shoulders that if we don't do more and if we don't articulate things better, we won't make it. And networks are the difference because we do exchange experiences and we support each other. Measuring success, I see that the networks are, and if we support the government efforts, civil society, if we support the academies, and I think there's a lot of potential to accelerate this.
Muchas gracias, Claudia.
Thank you, Claudia and Gala. We are reaching the end, even though obviously this discussion needs a lot more time, more connections like the ones you are mentioning right now. So we are closing today, but we're not closing this obviously in full. I want to thank Claudia and Gala for the presentations. Talking about the roles of women. I want to thank you for your time today, for these very important issues that you brought to the table. And it has been a pleasure to share this time with you, to listen, to take note, to some ideas on how we can better support each other and have these conversations in the future. I'd like to invite you to continue to follow CIPE, CIPE Black and CIPE Women. We will also put the information in the chat box, and also please look out for our events in the future in this series of the future of work in Latin America. Thank you so much again for your time, and we hope to see you again soon.